I mean, in some areas where my own views have changed. I remember having a debate about whether the Chinese economy would ever pass the American economy in nominal GDP, and I thought it would. And I think the president deserves tremendous credit for ensuring the growth of the American economy. And you see really the United States hopefully pulling away, obviously, investments in AI. But our problems relative to those of China, let alone other countries, are much more manageable in terms of the kind of structural economic factors.
So you're more optimistic about America's economic advantages than you would have been 8 years ago.
Yes.
大家好，今天要分享的是美国国防部政策副部长埃尔布里奇系科尔比的采访节选。很多观众对这个名字并不熟悉，但如今美国整套印太对华军事战略基本都出自他的规划与设计。科尔比出身情报相关家庭，拥有哈佛、耶鲁法学专业背景，深耕国家安全领域20余年，2017至2018年，他牵头撰写美国国防战略，首次将中国界定为美国首要大国竞争对手。后续又出版《拒止战略》一书，完整阐释美国在西太平洋的围堵思路。如今作为五角大楼核心高层，他在本次专访中直白剖析了美方对华、对台的底层军事逻辑。下面我们一起来完整观看这段采访内容。
So I want to take that agenda and go theater by theater and talk about how it plays out around the world. So China, right? In the first Trump term, you were part of the group that wrote the national security strategy that identified China as the U.S.'s geopolitical, I don't know what language you want to use, but rival adversary, right? In the second Trump administration, there seemed to be a certain amount of internal debate about whether that framing is correct, whether you want to emphasize more hemispheric defense or defense of the homeland and so on. So just give me your perspective. Is China the most important threat that the U.S. faces right now?
Couple things. One is talk and action are different. So our policy, as the Secretary has laid out, is strong and clear but quiet. So measure what the United States and the United States Department of War is doing by actions and not what we call peacocking, which I think is really different from the last administration where President Biden would speak off the cuff, for instance, about the issue of Taiwan. So, our view, as the national security strategy sets out, is we're going to have a strong denial defense along the first island chain, and we're going to work with our allies and partners to make sure that's the case.
Just for viewers and listeners, tell them what the first island chain is. The first island chain
is the chain of islands running down off the mainland coast of Asia, and it's a kind of standard strategic term going back to the 40s and 50s.
And is Taiwan considered part of the first island chain?
Well, obviously, I'm going to be careful about discussing Taiwan. And as Secretary Rubio pointed out, we have not had a change in our policy, but the overall goal is strategic stability. But to get to your second point about the policy on China, I think we also have to look at things across time, right? I mean, in 2016, President Trump was the first to really introduce that we needed to, relook at our policy towards China across the board, obviously the economic piece being vital as well. We're 10 years down the road. I think, people sometimes say, "Oh, Bridge, you're becoming such a dove, or you're falling away from your position." I don't think that at all.
So just for backdrop, you wrote a book called Strategy of Denial, which was a book arguing specifically that U.S. foreign policy should be oriented around deterrence against potential Chinese aggression in the Pacific. So that's the backdrop to anything someone says to you about China.
I've always been a realist. I'm certainly not an isolationist, but I'm also not an uber hawk. And I'm particularly, one of the areas where I think I've been very consistent is focusing more on, the reality of the situation, the structural elements rather than the rhetoric. And the fact that I personally engage with Chinese counterparts, that doesn't mean we're naive, to the contrary.
But so what is then the structural reality in terms of the actual balance of power? How is it different from 2016?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I mean, in some areas where my own views have changed. I remember having a debate about whether the Chinese economy would ever pass the American economy in nominal GDP, and I thought it would. And I think the president deserves tremendous credit for ensuring the growth of the American economy. And you see really the United States hopefully pulling away, obviously, investments in AI. But our problems relative to those of China, let alone other countries, are much more manageable in terms of the kind of structural economic factors.
So you're more optimistic about America's economic advantages than you would have been 8 years ago.
Yes, I am. And I think that's borne out by the performance. And for those who anticipated it, kudos. And that's one where I've kind of altered my view. Obviously,
but then how does that affect our defense strategy?
Right. A lot of that is financialization of the economy. Vice President Vance has been talking very eloquently about this. We need to reindustrialize. We need to be able to make sure that we can re-onshore some of these industrial capacities, because especially when you're looking at military production, a lot of that is really about reindustrialization. Obviously, we're also working with allies. The president set a new global standard of 3.5% on hardcore military spending. South Korea is committed to that. We're looking for other allies in the region to step up. The Australians are spending quite a bit as well. So that's going to contribute as well. What I would say is this is where we get back to the issue, again, of scoping the military strategy to denial.
Denial means, in practice, denying a great power adversary the ability to
seize and hold the key territory of a designated ally and partner. What we are trying to achieve along the first island chain is not regime changing somebody and occupying their country and pacifying them, blah, blah, blah. No. It is about maritime and aerospace defense along an archipelago. And that is something that really plays to the strengths of the United States. That's something that we, and I personally, am giving a great deal of thought to, because I think who knows what other people might be thinking, but let's make sure that they have every reason to think that such an endeavor would not be successful.
Okay. So there were reports last summer. Mm-hmm. There have been a lot of stories about you in the press, which I may reference occasionally over the course of this conversation. Mm-hmm. One such report said that you were pushing allies to clarify their own approach in the event of Chinese aggression. Does that mean, as you've said in this interview, the United States is famously strategically ambiguous in our own approach to what might happen if China were to attack Taiwan? Are we asking our allies to be less ambiguous than we are ourselves?
So I won't comment on specific conversations, going on in the Pentagon. But one thing I think people can, I think, fairly criticize me for my views, or maybe I'm too direct, or any number of things. I don't think somebody can criticize me for being inconsistent or unclear where I'm coming from. And I think this is a good example of where what we are asking our allies to do is, of course, I'm not going to ask them to do something that's way beyond what we would do. That violates common sense. That's not realistic. What we are trying to do is put everybody on the same page in terms of whatever contingency they might be facing, whether it's in Asia or Europe, and say, hey, what can we reasonably expect? I think with Japan, we're having much more candid conversations. With Australia, we're having much more candid conversations. And the different policy sort of particularities come out in a different way. But I think the vibe, that the message that we are trying to send, and I think is being received, is, oh, wow, these people are actually serious. Like, oh, they're actually planning to actually potentially get into that conflict precisely so they can avoid it, because that's the best way to deter a conflict, is by everybody having a clear sense of what they're supposed to be doing in that context. And then, oh, wait, I'm actually supposed to deploy forces that can do that? Some people are really getting it. Look at Germany, for instance. I think they're really, it's just historic change over the last couple of years, because they're saying, oh, the Americans are telling us, here's what we need to be able to do. And that, I think, if anything, I'm sort of certainly, the president has said, is really focused on peace. That's what our agenda is about. Obviously, you have to be prepared to use military force. That's what we're thinking about, but with the goal of peace and strategic stability.
Okay, last question on East Asia that will connect to questions about the Middle East, right? Which is, I have had any number of people watching what's gone on in the Middle East with the Iran conflict, right? With attacks on our bases there, missile attacks and so on, say, look, in the event of a conflict with China, the United States position right now is just untenable, that our bases and aircraft carriers around China are just not going to survive, day 1 to 20 of a conflict. And we will effectively have to fight our way back into the Pacific theater in that kind of scenario, whatever is happening with an actual Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And this is something, by the way, that the president, who you're very careful to praise throughout this conversation, has himself commented on repeatedly. Oh, Taiwan, it's so close to China, so far from the U.S.
You make a number of excellent points, and there's a lot of realities in there. This is why you really have to scope your objective. What is it that we are trying to achieve? We may be trying to project power in certain ways, but if, in this scenario, if China were to try to project power, it would also be trying to project power over significant bodies of water, whichever of those areas you're talking about. That's a very difficult proposition. Maritime warfare, amphibious warfare is very difficult. You not only have to get someplace, you have to sustain those operations. That is very complicated. That is why, obviously, we're focused on the ground forces, et cetera, the presence operations of the Navy, et cetera. But at the end of the day, what's really relevant in this context are platforms and munitions that can operate in heavily denied environments,
right,
and reach out and achieve very significant effects. Not perfection. Going back to the Battle of Britain, right? If you look at that analogy, you had the Royal Air Force. The British were outclassed in almost every measure of the military balance, but it was sufficient for the purposes. And that's where we're really giving a lot of thought.
When we're talking about platforms, we're talking about aircraft carriers primarily in the Pacific?
Look at the totality of the Navy has aircraft carriers, it has cruisers, it has destroyers, it has submarines. The Air Force has shorter range tactical aviation like F-35s. It also has B-52s, B-1s, and B-2s. Those have been employed quite a lot. The United States is also investing heavily in drones. The United States has ground-based fires that have been employed very effectively in the Middle East conflict. There's space capabilities, cyber. So there's a lot.
There's a lot, but you were essentially trying to set up a scenario where even if China has a big advantage, we have enough platforms surviving.
Advantage to do what? Right. That's always
for defense purposes.
And this is the thing about it is that I feel very confident that I am not being conniving or dissembling at all when I say that our posture is designed for strategic stability and the status quo and a balance of power, because it's not the kind of capabilities that you can use reasonably to conduct aggression against military power. So if everybody just stays to their side, everything will be fine. And I think that's a very realistic objective. I think it's not easy. That's why we focus a lot on it, but it's viable. And I think it's very consistent with the president's diplomacy and policy and all of our policy towards China, which is respectful, just speaks respectfully of China, does not purport, and this is different from some members of the president's last administration, talking about regime change in China.
We must induce China to change in more creative and assertive ways because Beijing's actions threaten our people and our prosperity.
That's not what we talk about.
So you think the second Trump administration has a more reasonable...
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think the president has had a consistent policy. Right. And I think right now, under his leadership, you have a policy of realism, which is a respectful, positive relationship at the top where you can make deals, but also an understanding that we need to operate from a position of strength.
I'm going to quote... Fareed Zakaria wrote a column for the Washington Post where he said that the Iran war has been good for China because it has, quote, accelerated three of China's long-held goals: a Middle East less dependent on America, a world more dependent on critical Chinese technology, and a reputation for Beijing as a serious and steady world power. That doesn't seem unfair to me. Does it seem unfair to you?
I actually think it's not true.
Okay, good.
Tell me why. Once more... fan of Zakaria's, but it's very kind of conventional wisdom-y.
Why is that conventional wisdom wrong?
So on the first one, remind me of the first one.
The first one is, he says, a Middle East less dependent on America, which I presume by that he means a Middle East where a lot of countries think that, the U.S. is just not going to be sort of permanently...
Well, I mean, it depends on how you're measuring it, but I would say the United States, obviously, a lot of the countries in the region are very worried about Iran, needless to say. And there's tremendous relations. The president just had a great meeting with the prime minister of Iraq. We've had a breakthrough in Syria. Obviously, very good relations with President Erdogan. Strong partnerships with, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi, et cetera. So, I mean, there's countries are playing different angles. One thing that I think is missed there is China does not come away from this situation looking glowingly. And, nobody's more, kind of exposed to Middle East oil over the long period of time than China and other countries and like that. At the same time, I would say the the U.S. oil and gas industry is doing phenomenally well, right? Obviously, there's structural issues where the flow of oil and gas out of the Strait remains important. That's one of the reasons why we're working to open it up. But I think that's another factor where, if you look at the growth of the American economy, energy production, et cetera, there's good news and the relative performances of the American and Chinese economy. So I actually think, look, I don't think we beat up on China or anything like that verbally, but I wouldn't trade our position at all. I think our position looks really good.
看完这段完整采访，相信很多人都会对科尔比传递出的整套美国对华战略有清晰直观的感受。我们不妨多层次拆解，客观聊聊这段访谈背后藏的信号、矛盾与现实局限。首先，先梳理科尔比整场发言的核心脉络。他反复对外宣称，美国打造第一岛链拒止防御的核心目的不是主动开战，只是通过前沿兵力、远程打击装备、盟友联动抬高我方采取军事行动的成本，以此守住美国在西太平洋的主导权。谈及台湾问题时，他毫不避讳将我国固有领土视作封锁链条的关键一环，甚至毫不掩饰地抛出冲突背景下摧毁台积电这类极端破坏性方案，全程只把台湾当成牵制、遏制中国大陆的战略棋子，完全无视岛内民众的生存、发展需求，刻意无视一个中国原则这一国际社会公认的基本准则。除此之外，他还清晰提出全球兵力重新分配方案，要求欧洲各国自主承担应对俄罗斯的防务压力，把美军绝大多数资源集中倾斜到印太区域，同时持续向日韩、澳大利亚等东亚大洋洲盟友施压，逼迫各国大幅提高国防开支，分摊美国遏制战略的军费与防务负担，直白表露美国不想独自承担霸权成本的心思。但这套看上去逻辑自洽的拒止战略，其实处处藏着无法化解的先天短板和现实矛盾。第一，从军事硬实力角度来看，经过多年稳步发展，我国海上作战平台、远程精确打击、近海防御体系都已经完成全方位升级。美军在西太平洋前沿基地航母编队距离本土遥远，补给链条冗长脆弱，多份公开兵棋推演，结果都显示，一旦爆发高强度区域冲突，美国很难低成本实现所谓拒止目标，长期大规模前沿部署只会持续消耗美军财政、装备与人员储备，长期难以为继。第二，从盟友体系层面分析，科尔比强硬逼迫各国增加军费、绑定对抗路线的做法，早已引发不少盟国抵触。欧洲多国不愿完全割裂和欧亚经贸联系，日韩国内民众对美军永久驻军、主动卷入大国冲突本身争议巨大。各国都有自身经济，民生核心诉求不可能无底线听从美国安排，美方精心搭建的围堵联盟内部裂痕只会持续扩大。第三，这套战略最根本的逻辑双标无法回避。嘴上反复标榜追求区域和平稳定，实际核心目标却是干涉中国内政，固化两岸分裂状态。台湾是中国不可分割的领土，有开罗宣言、波茨坦公告等一系列国际法文件作为铁证。任何依靠外部军事链条、外力介入拆分本国领土的构想，本身就违背国际法基本准则，长久来看根本不具备落地的现实根基。当然，我们不能单纯把这段访谈当作激进的对抗言论一笑置之，它具备极高的局势参考价值。科尔比身处美国国防决策核心圈层，是当下美国印太战略的实际操盘人之一。他的公开表态基本完整代表了特朗普政府现阶段对华、对台海的整体思路，读懂他的观点，我们就能清晰预判未来数年美国在亚太的一系列动作，持续升级对台军售，拉拢周边国家，构建多边封锁网络，加大第一岛链军备部署，持续施压盟友分摊防务开支等等，这也能为我们观察研判国际局势、完善自身国防与外交布局提供重要参考。同时，他的整套激进论调也给我们带来非常明确的警示，美国不会主动放弃利用台海议题牵制中国发展的图谋，外部遏制、围堵的压力会长期存在。想要守住自身发展环境，完整维护国家主权领土完整， 我们必须持续稳步夯实各领域综合实力，不断完善近海防御、远程打击力量，牢牢掌握处理台湾问题的主动权与主导权。与此同时，我们也要看清一个时代大趋势：冷战零和博弈。大国对抗思维早已不符合当下全球发展潮流。如今亚太地区绝大多数国家的核心诉求都是经济合作、和平发展、区域产业链深度绑定。各国都不愿被迫选边站，主动卷入大国对抗，消耗自身发展红利。美国这种单纯依靠军事围堵制造区域对立的策略，和地区各国的核心利益背道而驰，很难长久获得周边国家的持续支持。长期来看，必然会逐步失去生存土壤。最后和大家说明一下本期视频素材，片中所有内容均为科尔采访原声，原声没有进行台词篡改、恶意剪辑，完整保留它全部原始表述，就是为了让大家获取最客观的一手信息，自行独立思考，分辨美方战略的真实意图。如果你看完这段访谈，对美国印太战略、台海局势有不一样的看法，或是想深入了解更多美国核心军政人物的观点分析，都可以在评论区留言交流，我会逐条查看回复。如果这条视频能帮你看懂美国对华底层布局，带来新的思考，欢迎点赞、收藏、转发给身边感兴趣的朋友，点上关注。后续我会持续带来更多国际军政访谈，完整解读、深度拆解各国对外战略。我们下期再见。